All right, let's dive into some really fascinating stuff. We've got this collection of writings on Buddhism and psychology, and we're going to explore how those perspectives kind of intertwine, especially when it comes to ideas of awakening, the self, and personal growth.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix of sources, too. You've got excerpts from The Psychology of Awakening and then some others that explore these ideas from different angles.
Exactly. So we're going to see where they like intersect and maybe where they kind of clash a little bit. And I guess ultimately what it all means for how you see yourself and the world around you.
Yeah, and one of the things that jumps out from The Psychology of Awakening is how it frames that Buddhist message of liberation or enlightenment as a path to freedom from suffering. And it uses those Four Noble Truths as a framework.
The Four Noble Truths. Now, you've probably heard about these before, especially if you've explored Buddhism. But have you ever thought about them from like a psychological perspective? This source suggests they can be a roadmap, not just for spiritual understanding, but for like navigating the ups and downs of just daily life.
Right. It's about recognizing that suffering exists,
Right.
right? Understanding its root causes and acknowledging that freedom from suffering is possible, and then actively engaging in the path that leads to that freedom.
I see. It's interesting because the source points out how challenging it can be to actually integrate these spiritual insights into our, everyday Western lives. Like, it's
Yeah.
one thing to grasp the concept of non-attachment, when you're meditating, but it's a whole other thing to maintain that equanimity when you're stuck in traffic or you're dealing with a difficult coworker, right?
Oh, absolutely. The book even shares this story about a woman who was so driven by a sense of discontent in her life that she just threw herself into pursuing spiritual ideals. But in doing so, she ended up neglecting her own well-being. It's like she bypassed the whole, self-kindness part in her quest for self-transcendence.
It's a classic example of how we can get so focused on a goal, even a seemingly positive one, that we kind of lose sight of taking care of ourselves along the way.
And this brings us to another core concept that pops up throughout these writings, which is the idea of self.
Of course, Buddhism has a unique perspective on this with the doctrine of anatman or no self.
Now, you've probably heard of no self, but have you ever had an experience where, like, your sense of self just dissolved, maybe during deep meditation or when you were completely absorbed in an activity? Buddhism suggests that these moments might be glimpses into a more fundamental reality than our everyday experience of this solid, unchanging me. Exactly, and understanding that is key to understanding suffering itself, according to Buddhist thought. And of course, this is where things get interesting because this idea kind of bumps up against Western psychology's view of the self.
Yeah, Western psychology tends to see the self as the bedrock of our identity. Like, it's the core of who we are. So how do we reconcile these seemingly opposing viewpoints? Are we a solid self, or is that an illusion?
Well, one of your sources offers a really interesting perspective on this. It says the term subject helps us to conceive of human reality as a construction, as the product of signifying activities which are both culturally specific and generally unconscious.
So rather than being this fixed, unchanging essence, our sense of self is actually shaped by our culture, the language we use, the beliefs we hold, even the unconscious ways we interpret the world around us.
Precisely. It's like we're born into a particular culture, and that culture provides us with, like, a set of lenses through which we view ourselves and our place in the world.
It's like the self is a story we tell ourselves based on the narratives we've been given. But what happens when we start to question those stories? What happens when the narratives we've built our identities on start to crumble?
That's where things get really interesting. One of your sources connects this to the mimetic perspective of self. The idea that our minds are like fertile ground for memes, those units of cultural information that replicate and spread like viruses.
So are we saying that the self is like this meme complex, a collection of ideas and beliefs that have taken root in our minds and influence our thoughts, our feelings, and even our actions? But if the self is a construct, like a product of cultural conditioning, does that mean we have no real agency? Are we just like puppets of these
Yes,
memes?
that's the question, isn't it? And this source suggests that, like any good meme complex, the self has developed some pretty effective survival mechanisms. It resists information that challenges its validity, and it finds ways to perpetuate itself, even if those ways aren't ultimately serving our well-being.
It makes sense, though. If our sense of self is threatened, it feels like our whole world is crumbling. So we're wired to defend it, even if that means clinging to beliefs that might be causing us suffering. This source also digs into the role of culture in shaping our sense of self. and how it all ties back to that Buddhist idea of overcoming suffering.
Yeah, it highlights how differences in child rearing practices, particularly between Asian and Western cultures, can influence our self-other patterns. For instance, that close-knit, interdependent nature of many Asian cultures tends to foster a less rigid sense of self compared to the individualistic focus often seen in the
So
West.
we're seeing that cultural norms can really shape the foundation of our identity, even in a neurological level. It's not just about individual psychology, but the social and cultural context we're embedded in. But how does the concept of suffering fit into this? Does our culture actually contribute to our suffering?
That's what this source seems to suggest. It argues that modern Western culture, with its emphasis on individual achievement and the pressure to, construct a unique and successful soul, can lead to feelings of alienation and a sense that we're never quite good enough.
It's like we're constantly striving to prove ourselves, to stand out from the crowd, which creates this kind of existential angst that's, hard to escape. We're so focused on building this individual soul that we lose sight of the interconnectedness that Buddhism emphasizes.
And this source doesn't shy away from pointing out some potential downsides of this individualistic drive. It even draws a connection between Western cultural influences and some negative psychological trends in traditional
What kind
societies.
of trends? Give me an example.
Well, one striking example it gives is, the observation of increased aggression and insecurity in traditional societies after being exposed to Western media. It talks about the shift from cooperative to more greedy and competitive behavior in Ladakh, this remote region in the Himalayas, after, the introduction of Western influence.
Wow, that's a powerful illustration of how cultural values can have a ripple effect on individual behavior, even across vast distances. Really underscores how interconnected we truly are.
Makes you wonder if our sense of self is so intertwined with our culture and our culture can contribute to suffering, does changing our culture change our self?
That's a fascinating question. So we've looked at the Buddhist message of liberation, the concept of no self, and how culture shapes our sense of self. Where do we go from here?
Well, one of your sources introduces this concept called spiritual bypassing. It's the idea that we can sometimes use spiritual ideas and practices to avoid confronting our own emotional baggage.
Oh, spiritual bypassing. I've definitely seen that play out.
Yeah.
It's like we use spirituality as a way to feel superior or enlightened without doing that messy inner work of dealing with our shadow sides. I can see how that becomes a trap on the path to genuine personal growth.
Exactly, and the source gives some really poignant examples of this, like the woman who was manipulated by a spiritual teacher because she was seeking validation rather than, true growth. Or the man who used spiritual ambition to mask his own vulnerability.
Which reminds us that even spiritual paths can be fraught with pitfalls. True growth requires a healthy dose of honesty and self-awareness, even when it's uncomfortable. I'm curious, does the source offer any other insights or examples of this spiritual bypassing?
Yeah, this quote really stood out to me. In this way, spiritual communities can become a kind of substitute family, where the teacher is regarded as a good parent, while the students are striving to be good boys or good girls by towing the party line, trying to please the teacher as parent, or driving themselves to climb the ladder of spiritual success.
It's a powerful image. It makes you wonder, are we truly seeking liberation, or are we just recreating familiar patterns of seeking approval and validation, even within spiritual settings?
Yeah.
Like, are we using these practices to transcend the ego or just to inflate it?
It's a good reminder to question our motives and to make sure our spiritual practices are truly serving our growth and not just our egos.
Okay, so we've got spiritual bypassing, but what's next on this deep dive journey? It seems like we're starting to uncover some potential pitfalls on the path to personal growth.
Well, several of your sources delve into this sometimes complex relationship between psychological and spiritual work. They're exploring how those two approaches can either complement or clash with each other.
I've always felt like there's a connection between psychology and spirituality, but it's hard to articulate. Is it like a harmonious partnership, or are there inherent tensions between those two approaches?
Well, one key argument that emerges is that psychological work can support spiritual development by helping us address those unresolved emotional conflicts and traumas that might be, hindering our ability to fully embrace spiritual insights.
So it's like clearing out the mental and emotional clutter so that spiritual wisdom can actually take root and blossom. I can see how that would be important. Do you have any examples from the source material that illustrate that?
There's an interesting anecdote about a man named Paul who, despite having deep spiritual insights from his meditation practice, still struggled with anxiety around praise and blame. It turned out that this struggle stemmed from a deep-seated, unconscious dynamic of compliance and defiance that originated in his childhood.
So even though he could experience freedom from those feelings during meditation, those insights couldn't fully integrate into his life because of this unresolved pattern.
Exactly. It was through therapy, where he could acknowledge and work with those underlying needs and emotions, that he finally found true equanimity and integrated his spiritual understanding into his daily life.
That's beautiful. It shows how psychology and spirituality can work together to support real, lasting transformation. It really highlights the potential for synergy between those two approaches. But it sounds like there might also be potential clashes between psychological and spiritual work. Can you talk a little more about that?
Of course. One of your sources in discussing Buddhist psychotherapy points out that while both Buddhist teachings and Western psychotherapy aim to address suffering, they don't always have the same goals in mind.
So even though both paths acknowledge that suffering is real, they might have different ideas about what liberation looks like and how to get there.
Exactly. Buddhist psychology kind of leans towards transcending the ego, while Western psychotherapy often aims to strengthen and integrate the ego to help people function more effectively in the world.
That makes sense. They're coming from different cultural contexts and have
Yeah.
different philosophical underpinnings. So how do we navigate this? Is it about choosing one path over the other, or is there a way to integrate these different approaches?
That seems to be the question a lot of these sources are grappling with, and it doesn't seem like there's an easy answer. But one recurring theme is the importance of recognizing the limitations of both approaches and being willing to adapt them to the complexities of modern Western culture.
So it's about finding a middle way, a balance that honors the wisdom of both psychology and spirituality without getting bogged down in dogma or rigid interpretations.
And one of your sources specifically highlights the value of mindfulness and awareness practices, such as meditation, as tools for cultivating a deeper understanding of ourselves and others. It suggests that these practices can help us bridge the gap between our inner world and the outer world, between our individual experience and our interconnectedness with all beings.
That's interesting. It suggests that the real work, whether we're talking about psychology or spirituality, might be about waking up to the reality of our experience, both the personal and the transpersonal.
Precisely. It's about seeing through those illusions of the separate self and recognizing our interconnectedness with all beings. And that recognition, as Buddhist teachings emphasize, can be the foundation for a more compassionate and fulfilling way of life.
This has been quite a whirlwind tour of some pretty profound concepts. I feel like we're just getting started, though. I'm eager to delve a little deeper into how these ideas can be applied in our daily lives.
Well, one of your sources offers a fascinating perspective on the nature of mind and its relationship to the body. It delves into the concept of embodiment, suggesting that the mind isn't confined to the brain, but actually arises from our lived embodied experience in the world.
Okay, so we're not talking about the mind as this separate entity just floating around in our heads. It's more like the mind is an emergent property of our entire being, intricately interwoven with our physical sensations, emotions, and interactions with the world.
Exactly. And the source offers this thought-provoking quote: "The mind is not in the head. Cognition is an actively embodied co-determination of inner outer."
This challenges that traditional Cartesian view of this mind-body split and points toward a more holistic, interconnected understanding of who we are.
It also connects back to the Buddhist emphasis on mindfulness, which involves paying attention to our present moment experience, including our bodily sensations and emotions, without judgment.
So it's not just about sitting on a cushion meditating. It's about bringing that awareness into every aspect of our lives, from how we move our bodies to how we interact with others to how we experience the world through our senses.
Precisely. And this embodied perspective has some interesting implications for how we understand the relationship between mind and body, particularly when it comes to healing and well-being.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this embodied view of mind relate to healing?
One of your sources uses a playful analogy to explain how the mind works, which might help illuminate this connection between mind, body, and healing.
Lay that analogy on me.
Imagine the mind as a giant trampoline. Now, picture steel ball bearings representing thoughts and experiences being dropped onto this trampoline. Over time, the trampoline gets worn down in certain areas, creating dips and grooves where those ball bearings tend to collect.
I'm visualizing it. So are those dips and grooves like our habitual patterns of thinking and reacting?
Hmm.
The ways we've been conditioned to respond to the world based on our past experiences?
Exactly. And the source goes on to explain that there's something else happening beneath the surface of this trampoline. Imagine someone crawling underneath and hooking weights to it at various points.
So now the trampoline is even more distorted, creating deeper hollows that further influence the path of those ball bearings. Are those weights like our unconscious biases, beliefs, and uh, emotional baggage that shape our thoughts and perceptions?
You got it. It's a brilliant way to illustrate how our past experiences, both conscious and unconscious, can subtly influence our present moment awareness and shape the way we navigate the world. It also suggests that healing might involve becoming aware of those weights and finding ways to unhook them, creating more space for flexibility and choice in our lives.
This analogy really underscores how complex the mind is and how much is happening beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. I'm starting to see how understanding this could be incredibly valuable in like a therapeutic setting or even in our own personal growth journey.
Absolutely. It helps us appreciate the importance of exploring not just our conscious thoughts and beliefs, but also those deeper, often hidden patterns that can drive our behavior and create suffering.
It's like we need to become aware of the weights we're carrying, literally and figuratively, so we can start to loosen their grip and create more space for flexibility and choice in our lives.
And this ties back to the Buddhist teachings on impermanence and non-attachment.
So if the mind is like this constantly changing trampoline, shaped by our experiences, are we saying that who we think we are is also fluid and impermanent? That the self isn't fixed, but rather a process?
Exactly. The self, as Buddhism teaches, is not a fixed entity, but rather a dynamic process, constantly arising and passing away in every moment.
So how do we cultivate this awareness of the self as a process? How do we start to notice those weights and loosen their grip?
Mindfulness practices can be helpful here. By paying attention to our present moment experience, including our thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations, without judgment, we can start to see those ball bearings rolling around on the trampoline of our minds and notice where they tend to get stuck.
And by noticing where they get stuck, we might start to become aware of those underlying weights that are influencing their path.
Precisely. And through consistent practice, we can start to develop a more discerning awareness that allows us to choose how we respond to our experience rather than just reacting habitually or getting caught in those old grooves.
This is really making me rethink my understanding of the mind and its potential for growth and transformation. It's exciting and a bit daunting at the same time.
It's a journey, and like any journey, it has its twists and turns. But with patience, curiosity, and a willingness to explore, we can uncover a deeper understanding of who we are and our place in the world.
Well, I'm ready to keep exploring. Our next stop on this deep dive takes us into the realm of intersubjectivity.
Intersubjectivity is all about how our sense of self is shaped, not just by our individual experiences, but also by our interactions with others.
So we're moving beyond the isolated individual and recognizing that who we are is deeply influenced by our relationships and connections with other people. Makes you wonder, if our sense of self arises from interactions with others, what does that say about the idea of a separate, independent self?
One of your sources directly challenges that assumption that our minds are separate and impenetrable. It poses this question. The issue is squarely upside down. The presence and reality of other is so intimately close that the pertinent question is, how can we ever come to have the notion that we are that separate and distinct?
Wow, that's powerful. It flips the script on how we usually think about ourselves and others. It suggests that maybe we start from a place of interconnectedness, and then somehow along the way we develop this illusion of separation.
It's a radical shift in perspective, and one that has profound implications for how we understand empathy, compassion, and the potential for, genuine connection with others.
This is definitely a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But before we dive into those depths of intersubjectivity, it looks like we need to explore the sometimes rocky relationship between science and spirituality.
Ah, yes, the age-old debate between reason and faith. Your sources offer some interesting perspectives on how these two domains can either complement or clash with each other.
I'm curious about that intersection of science and spirituality, because I think both have a lot to offer when it comes to understanding the human experience. But they often seem to speak different languages. Do your sources offer any insight into how we might bridge that gap?
One of them cautions against drawing simplistic parallels between scientific discoveries and mystical experiences. While there might be, intriguing similarities, It's important to avoid reducing one to the other, or trying to use one to prove or disprove the other.
So it's not about trying to force science and spirituality into the same box, but rather recognizing that they offer different ways of knowing and experiencing the world, each with its own strengths and limitations. Do your sources address those limitations?
Absolutely. This particular source suggests that both science and spirituality can fall into their own traps. For example, scientists can sometimes cling to reductionist explanations, while spiritual seekers can get lost in dogma and blind faith.
It sounds like it's about approaching both domains with a critical mind, a healthy dose of skepticism, and an openness to being surprised by what we might discover.
And that's where the potential for dialogue and collaboration between science and spirituality gets really exciting. Your source suggests that by working together, science and spirituality can offer a more complete understanding of the mind and, human experience.
I love that. It's about embracing both reason and intuition, the empirical and the mystical, to gain a richer and more nuanced perspective on, the complexities of life. But I'm curious to hear more about how science, specifically, can inform our understanding of self and the human mind. What do your sources have to say about that?
One of your sources delves into the field of evolutionary psychology and offers a fascinating analogy to explain how our brains prioritize certain needs and behaviors. It introduces the concept of the self-survival system, or SS, which acts like a hidden control center in the brain, influencing our perceptions and actions.
The self-survival system. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more about how this SS operates and how it might impact our understanding of ourselves.
The source compares the SS to a kind of cognitive Politburo, a ruling elite that can hijack our brain's resources and prioritize its own agenda, even if those priorities aren't in our best interest.
So this SS has its own set of survival mechanisms and will do whatever it takes to keep us feeling safe and secure, even if that means clinging to limiting beliefs or reacting in ways that ultimately create suffering.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the SS often operates on autopilot, outside of our conscious awareness. It can distort our perceptions, bias our interpretations, and lead us to react in ways that don't align with our values or long-term well-being.
So, like, we have this inner saboteur that's constantly working to protect us, but sometimes its methods backfire and create more problems than they solve. It makes you wonder, how much free will we actually have if this SS is calling the shots behind the scenes?
That's a good question. But the good news is that understanding this dynamic can be crucial in our journey of self-discovery and growth. It helps us recognize that our thoughts and behaviors aren't always rational or in our best interest. Sometimes they're driven by deeper, often unconscious fears and survival mechanisms.
So how do we deal with this inner saboteur? How do we become aware of its influence and start to make more conscious choices?
The source suggests that mindfulness practices can be helpful. By cultivating a non-judgmental awareness of our thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations, we can start to notice when the SS is in control and choose to respond differently.
It's like shining a light on those unconscious patterns and bringing them into the realm of conscious awareness. We might not be able to get rid of the SS entirely, but we can learn to recognize its tactics and choose not to be ruled by them.
It's a powerful message of empowerment. It suggests that while we might not have complete control over our thoughts and actions, we can cultivate the awareness and the skills to make choices that align with our values and, create more fulfilling life.
This exploration of the self-survival system is really challenging my assumptions about free will. But the idea that we can reclaim our agency through mindfulness is incredibly inspiring.
It's a reminder that the path to awakening, to true freedom and well-being, is a journey of self-discovery and transformation. And it's a journey that we can all embark on, regardless of our background or beliefs.
I can't wait to see what other insights we uncover as we continue this deep dive.
It's interesting to think about how the self-survival system might actually hinder our natural capacity for compassion and generosity.
That's a surprising thought. I always assumed compassion was just hardwired into us as social creatures. So how does this SS get in the way of, our better angels, so to speak?
Well, this source argues that we've evolved to care about both our individual well-being and the well-being of those around us. And often those two priorities work in harmony, but sometimes they clash.
It's like a tug of war between self-interest and the impulse to care for others. When do those two forces butt heads?
This source suggests that when the SS perceives a threat to our survival, whether real or imagined, it can kind of override our compassionate impulses and prioritize self-preservation.
Makes sense if you think about it. If we're feeling threatened or insecure, our brains are going to focus on keeping us safe, even if that means temporarily putting our own needs ahead of others.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. This source proposes that when our basic needs are met, when we're not feeling threatened, our natural inclination towards compassion can actually emerge as the dominant force.
So it's like compassion is our default setting, but fear and insecurity can kind of hijack that impulse and send us into self-preservation mode.
This source even uses the term bodhisattva, a term from Buddhism, which refers to someone who is dedicated to liberating all beings from suffering, to describe this inherent capacity for compassion.
That's a beautiful concept. Are we saying that everyone has this bodhisattva nature within them just waiting to be, like, uncovered?
That's what this source seems to suggest, that our capacity for kindness and generosity is always there, even if it's sometimes obscured by our survival mechanisms.
That's a reassuring thought. It
Yeah.
seems like we're starting to see how science and spirituality can offer these complementary perspectives on the same phenomena,
Yeah.
compassion. But before we get too carried away with our bodhisattva nature, let's circle back to intersubjectivity. I'm ready to dive into how our relationships shape our sense of self.
One of your sources offers a fascinating perspective on this. It explores how our early experiences of connection and attunement, particularly with our primary caregivers, can actually shape the structure of our brains.
This is where it starts to get really mind-blowing for me. Are we saying that our relationships, especially in those early formative years, literally leave an imprint on our, like, neurology?
That's exactly what the research suggests. This source cites studies on infant development, showing how those early interactions with caregivers can influence the development of the orbitofrontal cortex. That's a part of the brain that plays a crucial role in regulating our emotions and social behavior.
So if a child experiences consistent love, care, and attunement in those early years, it helps to create a more secure and stable foundation for their emotional and social development.
That's the idea. And conversely, if those early experiences are characterized by, neglect, trauma, or insecure attachment, it can have a lasting impact on our ability to regulate our emotions, form healthy relationships, and just navigate the world with a sense of safety and trust.
This makes me think about that whole nature versus nurture debate. It sounds like both play a significant role in shaping who we become.
Yeah, it's not a simple either scenario. Both our genetic predispositions and our early relational experiences interact in these complex ways to shape our brains and our sense of self.
It's a powerful reminder of how crucial those early experiences are. It's not just about emotional well-being. We're talking about the very architecture of our brains being influenced by our earliest relationships.
And this, I think, offers a deeper understanding of those, Buddhist teachings on interconnectedness. We're not just interconnected in some abstract spiritual sense, like our brains are literally wired for connection.
I'm starting to see how psychology and neuroscience are providing a scientific basis for what spiritual traditions have been saying for centuries about the importance of relationships and connection.
It's as if science is catching up to what our hearts have always known.
This makes me think about how we can apply this understanding to, like, improve our relationships and create more fulfilling connections.
Well, one of your sources explores just that. It emphasizes the importance of understanding how our early relational patterns can impact our present-day interactions.
Because those early experiences with caregivers, those first blueprints for connection, really lay the foundation for how we relate to others later in life, right? They shape our expectations of intimacy, our ability to trust, even our capacity for compassion.
Precisely. And this source describes a therapeutic approach called core process psychotherapy, which suggests that by becoming aware of these, ingrained patterns, we can start to make more conscious choices in our relationships and create more fulfilling connections.
So it's not just about accepting those patterns as fixed and unchangeable, but rather about recognizing them and finding ways to, like, shift them if they're not serving us.
Exactly. It's about healing those old wounds from our past and creating a more secure foundation for, forgiving and receiving love.
It sounds like a lot of work. Is it really possible to unravel those deeply ingrained patterns and create truly healthy, fulfilling relationships?
Well, the source suggests that it's an ongoing process, a journey of self-discovery and growth that unfolds over time. It may not be easy, but it's certainly possible.
I'm feeling hopeful. It seems like there's a lot we can do to create more fulfilling relationships, both with ourselves and with others.
It's about being willing to look inward, to understand our own patterns and how they might be playing out in our interactions with, with other people.
And it's about having compassion for ourselves and others, recognizing that we're all doing the best we can with the resources we have.
Absolutely. And one of your sources reminds us that sometimes those resources include some pretty, deep-seated unconscious beliefs about who we are.
This is making me think back to that mimetic perspective of self that we discussed earlier.
Right. One of your sources dives deeper into that perspective, suggesting that who we think we are is actually a collection of ideas and beliefs that have, taken root in our minds and influence our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
So we're back to the idea of the self as a construct, a story we tell ourselves based on the narratives we've absorbed from our culture and our experiences. But this source takes it a step further, saying that the self is this meme complex, a collection of replicating units of cultural information that have, colonized our minds.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that this source argues that the self, like any good meme complex, has these survival mechanisms. It resists evidence that challenges its validity and finds ways to perpetuate itself.
It makes sense when you think about it. If our sense of self is threatened, our whole world feels like it's crumbling. So we're wired to defend it, even if that means clinging to beliefs that aren't actually true or helpful.
And this source argues that one of the most successful meme complexes is the idea of a separate, independent self. It suggests that this meme has survived and thrived because it offers a sense of control and predictability in a world that can often feel chaotic and overwhelming.
It's like we cling to this idea of a separate self because it gives us a sense of agency, a feeling that we're in the driver's seat of our own lives. But if that sense of separation is an illusion, as Buddhist teachings suggest, then what does that mean for, our sense of agency?
As a question worth pondering, the source suggests that this sense of separation, while comforting, is actually a fabrication of the mind. It points to the Buddhist teachings on interconnectedness and the idea that our true nature is one of interdependence, not independence.
So we're back to that radical notion of no self, the idea that solid, unchanging me is a mirage, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the world.
Precisely. And the source suggests that recognizing this illusion can be incredibly liberating. It can free us from the tyranny of the ego, that constant striving for self-preservation and validation, and open us to a more spacious and compassionate way of being.
That's a lot to take in. It's like we're being invited to question everything we thought we knew about ourselves and to embrace a more, a more fluid, interconnected understanding of who we are. It's both exciting and a little bit terrifying.
It's a journey, and like any journey, it has its risks and rewards. But with courage, curiosity, and a willingness to, let go of our old stories, we can discover a world of possibility that we never knew existed.
This has been an incredible exploration. We've delved into the depths of Buddhist teachings, explored the complexities of Western psychology, and even ventured into the realm of dreams and evolutionary psychology.
We've uncovered some profound insights into the nature of self, the power of relationships, and the potential for transformation.
And it seems like our next stop on this deep dive will bring us full circle back to that core Buddhist message of liberation and the path to awakening.
Absolutely. One of your sources offers a fascinating perspective on how those ancient teachings can be applied in the modern world, particularly in the context of challenging social and economic structures that create suffering.
So we're moving beyond individual psychology and exploring how Buddhist principles can inform our actions in the world, our engagement with, social justice, and our efforts to create a more just and compassionate society.
Exactly. This source, which focuses on the concept of dharma in action, highlights the importance of recognizing the systemic nature of suffering and the ways in which our individual choices and actions can either perpetuate or, challenge those systems.
So it's not just about meditating on a cushion and cultivating inner peace. It's about bringing that awareness and compassion into the world and working to alleviate the suffering of all beings.
Precisely. And the source emphasizes the importance of working at both the individual and collective levels. It suggests that by cultivating mindfulness and compassion in ourselves, we can become more effective agents of change in the world.
It's about integrating our inner work with our outer actions, aligning our values with our choices, and, using our voices and actions to create a more just and loving world.
It's a powerful call to action rooted in those Buddhist teachings on compassion and skillful action.
This makes me think about how overwhelming it can feel to, address systemic issues like poverty, inequality, and climate change. Do your sources offer any guidance on how to avoid burnout or a sense of hopelessness when tackling these complex challenges?
Well, one of them explores the concept of localization as a practical way to embody these values and create a more sustainable and compassionate way of life.
So we're talking about shifting away from that globalized, consumer-driven economy and embracing a more localized, community-based approach that prioritizes, connection, sustainability, and well-being. I'm curious to learn more about what that looks like in practice.
This source suggests that that shift can happen at both the individual and, the collective levels. It encourages us to support local businesses, grow our own food, reduce our consumption, and build stronger connections within our communities.
It's about making conscious choices that align with our values and voting with our dollars and our actions to create a world that's more in harmony with our true nature.
It's a message of empowerment that aligns with those Buddhist teachings on simplicity, non-attachment, and right livelihood.
I'm feeling inspired to start making changes in my own life. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what do your sources have to say about that ultimate goal of the Buddhist path? The concept of awakening or enlightenment. What does it actually mean to awaken?
That's the big question, isn't it? Your sources offer a variety of perspectives, but one recurring theme is this idea of transcending that illusion of the separate self and recognizing our fundamental interconnectedness with all beings.
So it's about waking up from the dream of separation and realizing that we're all part of one vast interconnected web of life. But how do we actually get there? What does that awakening look like in practice?
This source highlights the importance of cultivating wisdom and compassion as essential qualities of awakening.
Because wisdom allows us to see through the illusions of the ego and recognize our true nature, while compassion motivates us to act in ways that benefit all beings. It's a beautiful vision, but it also feels somewhat abstract and difficult to grasp.
This source suggests that these qualities can be cultivated through practices like, meditation, mindfulness, and ethical conduct.
So it's not just about having some mystical experience or reaching some blissful state. It's about embodying those qualities in our thoughts, words, and actions every day.
Precisely. It's about living an awakened life, a life that's characterized by presence, kindness, and a deep understanding of our interconnectedness with all beings.
This has been an incredibly inspiring and thought-provoking exploration. We've covered so much ground, from the foundations of Buddhist psychology to modern psychological theories, from the depths of the unconscious to the heights of, spiritual awakening.
And we've discovered that these seemingly disparate perspectives offer complementary insights into the nature of self, the power of relationships, and the potential for human transformation.
It feels like I now have this whole new toolkit for navigating those, complexities of life and cultivating greater wisdom, compassion, and peace.
Remember, it's a lifelong journey. There's always more to discover and explore.
It feels like, we've been circling around this idea of awakening this whole time, but what does that actually look like in everyday life? Is it about like reaching some heightened state of consciousness, or is it something more grounded and practical?
Well, one of your sources offers a helpful framework for understanding this by revisiting those Four Noble Truths, but this time through a more psychological lens. It suggests we can apply these truths not just to, our spiritual understanding, but to navigating the complexities of our inner and outer worlds.
The Four Noble Truths, it feels like we've been dancing around them this whole time. I'm ready for a deeper dive into how they relate to this idea of awakening.
Yeah, so the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, is presented not as some abstract philosophical concept, but as a universal human experience. It's an invitation to just acknowledge that life, by its very nature, includes, challenges, disappointments, loss.
It's about recognizing that those experiences are like part of being human, no matter how much we might try to avoid them or resist them.
Right, and this source points out that our suffering isn't just about what happens to us externally, right? It's also about our internal reactions to those events, the stories we tell ourselves, the ways we cling to what we want and push away what we don't want.
So it's not just the external circumstances, but our relationship to those circumstances, right? It's about the mental and emotional habits we bring to those experiences.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second noble truth, the truth of the cause of suffering. This source frames it in terms of our habitual patterns of craving and aversion, the ways we get caught in these cycles of desire and, attachment.
Because those patterns create a kind of internal friction, right? Like a struggle against the the natural flow of life.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly trying to control experience, to force things to be a certain way, which creates tension and resistance. And the source suggests that by becoming aware of those patterns, we can begin to, loosen their grip and create more space for peace and freedom.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does the third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of suffering, fit into this framework? Does it mean that we reach some state where we never experience pain or difficulty again?
Well, that's a common misconception. This source suggests that the end of suffering isn't about achieving some blissful state where nothing bad ever happens. It's about recognizing that all things are impermanent, our thoughts, feelings, experiences, even our, sense of self, and learning to ride the waves of life without getting swept away.
So it's about developing a kind of equanimity, a steady mind that can weather the storms of life without losing its center. But how do we actually cultivate that kind of equanimity?
That brings us to the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. And this source presents it as a journey of self-discovery and transformation, a path of cultivating wisdom, compassion, and skillful action.
So it's not a passive process of just waiting for suffering to end. It requires like active engagement, a commitment to cultivating certain qualities and engaging in certain practices.
Exactly. And it's a path that unfolds in every aspect of our lives. Our relationships, our work, our creative pursuits, even our engagement with social and political issues. It's about living an awakened life, a life that's characterized by presence, kindness, and, a deep understanding of our interconnectedness with all beings.
Wow, this entire deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've explored such a vast landscape of ideas from, the foundations of Buddhist psychology to modern psychological theories, from the depths of the unconscious to the heights of spiritual awakening.
Yeah, and we've discovered that these seemingly disparate perspectives can actually offer complementary insights into the nature of self, the power of relationships, and the potential for human transformation.
It feels like I have this whole new toolkit now for navigating the complexities of life and cultivating greater wisdom, compassion, and peace.
Remember, it's a lifelong journey, though. There's always more to discover and explore.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with this question to ponder. If the self is a construct, as we've explored, what does that mean for your sense of agency and responsibility in the world? What kind of self do you choose to create, knowing what you now know?
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep opening to that vast mystery of who you are and what you're capable of becoming.
That's a perfect note to end on. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep seeking those aha moments. They're out there waiting to be discovered.